Some movies become famous almost overnight. They receive major advertising campaigns, international releases, and years of attention. But other films take a completely different path. They appear quietly, reach a relatively small audience, and eventually disappear from the spotlight. Then, years later, curious viewers begin discovering them again. The World of Ludovic, released in 1993, is one of those films. Before we explore the story, here's a quick fact for anyone discovering this movie for the first time. The film has an IMDb rating of around 6.5 out of 10, although its rating is based on a relatively small number of users compared with much more widely known movies. Directed by Belgian filmmaker Jean-Pierre De Decker, the movie takes a quiet look at childhood, friendship, family relationships, and the difficult transition toward adolescence. There are no massive action sequences, no expensive visual effects. Instead, the movie concentrates on people and emotions. And that's exactly what makes it interesting. So today, let's take a closer look at the World of Ludovic, the story behind the film, the people who created it, and why this little-known European production continues to attract attention. At the center of the story is Ludovic, a young boy approaching adolescence. He's at an important stage of life. He's still young enough to experience the world with curiosity and imagination, but he's beginning to notice that the adult world is much more complicated than he once believed. For Ludovic, growing up isn't simply about getting older. It's about learning how people behave. It's about understanding relationships, and it's about discovering that adults don't always have simple answers. The film presents these experiences from a young person's perspective. Instead of immediately explaining everything to the audience, it allows us to observe the world as Ludovic experiences it. That approach gives the story its distinctive tone. Unlike many coming-of-age movies, The World of Ludovic doesn't depend on constant dramatic events. Its story develops through everyday experiences, conversations, friendships, family interactions, moments of uncertainty, and situations that may seem small at first but become meaningful later. This makes the movie feel less like a traditional adventure and more like a memory from childhood. The film understands something important about growing up. The experiences that shape us aren't always the biggest events. Sometimes they're the conversations we barely remember at the time. Sometimes they're the people we unexpectedly meet. And sometimes they're the moments when we realize that the world isn't as simple as we thought. One of the most important developments in Ludovic's life is his friendship with Sophie, played by Bella Van Meel. Ludovic is portrayed by Matthias Coppens. Their relationship gives Ludovic someone with whom he can share experiences and emotions. For a young person trying to understand a complicated world, that kind of connection can be extremely important. The film doesn't treat friendship as something superficial. Instead, it shows how relationships can influence the way young people understand themselves. Through these experiences, Ludovic begins to develop a greater sense of trust and independence. The adults surrounding Ludovic are another important part of the story. The movie doesn't simply divide them into heroes and villains. Instead, they are presented as ordinary people dealing with their own responsibilities and difficulties. From Ludovic's perspective, adults can sometimes appear as though they know everything. But as he becomes more aware of the world around him, he discovers that adults can also be uncertain. They make mistakes, they misunderstand situations, and they sometimes struggle with problems of their own. This realization is an important part of growing up. Children gradually discover that the people they once viewed as all-knowing are simply human beings trying to navigate life. The movie's quiet storytelling is supported by its visual approach. Cinematographer Michel Van Laer used natural-looking lighting, carefully composed shots, and real locations to create an authentic sense of place. That fits the story. The movie isn't trying to make childhood look larger than life, it's trying to make it feel believable. Behind the camera was director Jean-Pierre De Decker. His approach was focused on character and emotion rather than spectacle. The screenplay was written by Ger Bakenkamp, whose work emphasizes the different ways children and adults understand the same situations. That international background is another interesting part of the movie's history. It shows how European television productions could bring together talent and resources from several countries to tell relatively intimate stories. This is where the film's history becomes particularly interesting.
The movie gradually became difficult for international audiences to discover. But the rise of online film communities gave forgotten movies another opportunity. Collectors and fans of European cinema began sharing information about obscure productions. Films that had once been difficult to find could suddenly become topics of discussion. The World of Ludovic benefited from this renewed interest. Viewers who discovered it often appreciated its understated storytelling, natural performances, and emotional approach to childhood. It didn't suddenly become a mainstream classic. Instead, it became something perhaps more interesting. A film with a small audience of people actively interested in preserving and discussing it. This is where historical context becomes important. A movie made in 1993 reflects the cultural environment in which it was produced. Audiences today may interpret certain scenes differently from viewers who first encountered the film decades ago. Some moments involving the young protagonists have generated discussion among modern viewers, particularly because social attitudes and expectations have changed over time. But it's important not to exaggerate the film's history. The available material does not establish that the movie was officially banned or censored because of these discussions. So rather than presenting the movie through sensational claims, it's more useful to examine it in its historical context and consider why different generations might respond to it differently. That's part of what makes film history fascinating. Movies can remain the same while the audience changes. When you step back from the individual events, the World of Ludovic is ultimately a story about growing up. Ludovic is learning how relationships work. He's learning that friendship can be meaningful. He's learning that adults are not perfect. And he's beginning to understand that becoming older means taking greater responsibility for how he sees the world. The film doesn't suggest that growing up happens overnight. Instead, it happens gradually, experience by experience, conversation by conversation, mistake by mistake. And that's something almost every viewer can relate to. More than 30 years after its release, The World of Ludovic remains an obscure title. It doesn't have the worldwide recognition of many major films from the early 1990s, but obscurity doesn't automatically mean insignificance. Sometimes a movie simply doesn't receive the distribution or promotion necessary to reach a large audience. The film's legacy comes from the people who continued to remember it and the viewers who discovered it later. Its strength isn't spectacle, it's observation. The movie watches its characters experience ordinary moments and allows those moments to carry emotional weight. Not every movie becomes a blockbuster, not every film appears on lists of the greatest movies ever made, and not every worthwhile story receives the attention it deserves when it is first released. The World of Ludovic is an interesting example of that. Released in 1993, it offered a quiet European perspective on childhood, friendship, family, and the transition toward adolescence. Today, its modest reputation and limited exposure make it an intriguing piece of European television history. Its IMDb rating of around 6.5 out of 10 suggests a mixed but generally respectable level of audience interest, although the relatively small number of ratings shouldn't be treated as a definitive measure of the film's quality. And perhaps that's the best reason to revisit movies like this, not because they're secretly the greatest films ever made, but because they show us how many stories exist outside the mainstream. Some are forgotten, some are rediscovered, and some simply wait for a new audience willing to give them another look. So, what do you think about The World of Ludovic? Is it an underrated European coming-of-age film? Or is its quiet style better understood as a reflection of early 1990s television cinema? Share your thoughts in the comments.